Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Glass. When you're making a film that comments on superhero movies or comic books, and it's pretty clear you don't actually know much about the subject matter, in some ways that can be interesting. You can take certain archetypes and ideas that you know of comic books that almost everyone knows and do something with that. The original Unbreakable does that, as well as the original Incredibles does that. They're from kind of an outside perspective and they do something different with it. Most comic book movies, especially now, are done by people who have a familiarity with comic books and the storytelling of it. But when you have an outsider, you can do interesting stuff. And I think Unbreakable had a real thesis and theory and used that to make an interesting thriller. When you get to Glass, you can tell he didn't really have any other ideas, and M. Night wasn't really interested in looking at what this film genre has become since the last movie, which is a lot of things, or like read other comic books or understand them, or actually understand the terms that he's referring to, which he doesn't. This movie is acting like it has a thesis, and he kind of does a rush job. It has a twist, if you're wondering. Kind of a conclusion that reminds you more of the weaknesses and why we didn't like M. Night than the last two films, which sort of reminded you why we did like M. Night. I kind of almost look at him now as like this kind of perpetual phoenix. He'll rise from the ashes and people will be like, oh, you know, M. Night's pretty good if you just let him do a simple thriller. And then, you know, he'll flame out and he'll become the ashes again. And this will just be a perpetual circle of life cycle for the rest of his career. I just expect the next movie to be even worse. And then the next one will be bad. And it'll just continue. Because this film is very lazily written. Like, by the way, the interesting thing was when I actually researched a little bit, even though I had heard for the longest time that he wanted to make like a trilogy, apparently he was a little non-committal on that. He's like, I sort of said that, but I didn't really have a plan. And like, even like back in the 2000s, before this was even a possibility, he would always like kind of shut it down. So it might be like fool on us to think that he had some sort of plan when he was very much before was like, no, I really don't have a plan. Stop saying I have a plan. So apparently he didn't have a plan. And if you watch this film, it's very obvious. And this does remind me of Incredibles 2 quite a bit in that I don't like it, but also in that it doesn't have a theory. It's just like, oh, they're all back together again. And at the end of The Incredibles, I was like, oh, I would love that. And then you realize, no, that would suck. Like, that would not be the same thing. That would not be a good movie, because what worked about Unbreakable and The Incredibles is they had like a theory about what they're saying about superheroes, about super being people, about like recontextualizing them and putting them in a different world, and that can be insanely interesting if you're able to do that. And both those films make you think about those things. And I'd say Unbreakable does it at a time when, you know, there were barely any superhero movies. X-Men had come out just a few months before the first X-Men. And in Glass, I don't think he understands, like, in one part, like, Glass mentions that he thought this was going to be like a limited edition, which is weird because, like, the conclusion of the movie keeps referring to, this isn't a spoiler, that's like a limited edition. But this was like a major plot point conclusion. Like, no comic book company is gonna be like, you know what, we'll just put out a limited run of this because we don't like making money or something. A limited edition, just to inform M. Night, in case anyone was wondering, is like a comic book with a limited run, not meant to have an epically crazy conclusion with all the characters in it that wraps up a huge plot point. Like, that's not actually what it would be, or like a variant cover or something. I don't know why he was saying that. That's like this guy's whole theory of it. I mean, I sort of like that he was able to connect these things in a way. I mean, this is kind of like M. Night's Avengers. I was almost, because all these things about super being people, I was very curious if Haley Joel Osment was going to show up at some point and say, like, I see dead people. But he doesn't, spoilers. It did feel like, you know, with both this and The Incredibles 2, it's like you had all these things happen with superhero cinema. And you think, like, oh, this is so good that you could comment on these things. And clearly, like, Glass is pretty much made because we live in a post comic book continuity era that you would want to comment on that, but like, he just doesn't, and you're just like, oh, okay. I mean, that's the weird thing about it. It's not a superhero deconstruction. It's just like, hey, there could be superheroes. It's a power fantasy sorta, and like I don't understand what he's trying to say in this other than that he could make it. And I also don't think he fully understands the genre enough. Like, he wanted to say this thing and he didn't do enough research or figure out these things, or like, it feels like he almost has a little contempt for the genre while at the same time wanting to do something with it. I mean, some of these things, like, they can work for one movie, but when you go into like another movie, you need to like continue that theory. And this just feels like you had before, it was like, because this happened and then that happened and because that happened this happened, which is good writing. And this becomes like, and then this and then this and then this, and that's when it starts to really break down, because the cause and effects are kind of strange. It feels like they never really understand like they're doing with these superhero archetypes. Like, I understand like Bruce Willis is the hero and Samuel L. Jackson's Glass character is the villain, which, why is this movie called Glass? Is because one was called Unbreakable after Bruce Willis, one was called Split after James McAvoy, so he just gets a movie. But it's like, I don't really look at this film as like more around Mr. Glass. Like, maybe they should have done that. That probably actually would have been more interesting what came out in the end. But it's like the Horde is just like another villain. Like, that's the other thing. It's like when you had Samuel Jackson and Bruce Willis, like, they're counter opposites of each other. That's why they play off of each other. But the Horde character, like, it'd be interesting if James McAvoy's character like had trouble picking between each side and there was like a moral dilemma, but they like sort of don't do anything. He's just like another person there. It's like, get it? Because these guys are here. And you're like, I get it, but what are you doing with it? It's like this film never commits to that. And even with like Sarah Paulson's character, she doesn't have proper motivations. You don't really get into her enough, so she almost feels like kind of a blank slate for a lot of it. Sarah Paulson can play a blank slate better than anybody, but it was one of her weaker roles because M. Night didn't properly write things for her. And Anna Taylor-Joy's character, like, things are changed in weird ways. Like, I don't exactly understand what his full motivation was for doing all these things. It just felt like he kind of like cared more about getting people together and kind of using his very loose understanding of comic books, which I honestly felt a little both offended by and also wondering, like, this is how little you cared. You're just like, comic book terms, I don't know, you'll love it, who cares? With M. Night, when he gets things to work, it feels like he has a preciseness and he's a real good thriller director, and he understands how to construct things and do beautiful cinematography and understand how to use the camera and say certain things with his mysteries and with his thrillers, and say a lot of like major things about us as humanity and the characters. And, you know, when he wants to be, he can be a very good director. It doesn't happen very frequently, but then you get these other things and it just feels like he's sort of phoning it in. Like, he doesn't really understand what kind of story he's telling or what the thesis of it is, other than like, hey, this thing happened, you know? And you're just like, yeah, I know, but like, what are you doing with it? I just wish M. Night Shyamalan would just make good low-budget thrillers. I like that about him. And now that we're back in the same situation we literally were in before, I know this is like cheaper, and if you're gonna like rank his filmography, honestly, this film isn't as bad as some of the worst ones. It's not like good by any means, but it's like maybe not as bad as people are making it out to be. But I don't think it's like a great movie or anything like that. I don't think he's really someone who should work with a big budget. Some directors can do that and some directors can, and he's so much better without any money. He can just pay for them all himself. I don't think he paid for this one, but he paid for Split and The Visit himself. And I think looking at Glass, it's like pretty clear like that's what he should be doing. It's interesting when he works with the studio. I don't even really blame the studio. I just like, I think something happens to M. Night Shyamalan and he loses all like focus. I don't care if you like The Visit or Split, but it had a perspective, it had a theory behind it, had something going into like what made that movie its unique self. And in Glass, it just doesn't feel that way. M. Night's whole, like how he directs, how he writes, how he forms stories, all work if there's a point. And without one, I mean, and you think of his big ones like Sixth Sense or Unbreakable, there's a point to everything, almost. You know, that's why like the twist or whatever in Sixth Sense sort of like works and that movie holds up. And you look at Glass and like the ultimate point doesn't really work, isn't deserved, and is sort of out of date with where we are. And not out of date in like just because it's out of date it's bad. It's out of date in a way that like you don't really understand what you're talking about. I think ultimately with Glass it just fails to really become the kind of statement about anything or a deconstruction. And it sometimes feels like the elements are there to be some sort of a deconstruction. It just doesn't come to a point about anything. And I think that's kind of the saddest thing about Glass, is because you had the opportunity, you had people excited, you finally followed up on Breakable, and everyone say, oh, if you'd only gotten to do that, think of how interesting that could have been. And it's kind of like he answered that, and you're like, oh, that's just frankly disappointing. And it felt like the longer this movie went on, the more disappointed I was in this whole film and this whole concept and him as a filmmaker. And it just felt like we're in this endless feedback loop of being surprised again by him and then disappointed, and it's just never going to stop because he doesn't fully understand how to use his structures, how to use his points. He just wants to try to act like they're going to come, but he should understand that he needs to have a point to get to. When he gets to the part of the movie that he pretends has a point, there has to be a point there. And Glass, in all of its pontificating about comic book characters and all this stuff, its real arch nemesis is itself, because in itself it's not Glass. It wouldn't be Glass at all, which is the biggest problem with the movie, is the writer should be Mr. Glass. And unfortunately, this movie, I don't think it's one of the other characters. I just think it's a clueless bystander who probably walked by and then summarized it to a friend, is basically how this movie was written. And that's ultimately not very much of a hero at all. So if you've seen Glass and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.